My granddad was not a well-educated man. He left school in the 5th grade because he didn't want to repeat it for the 3rd time. And he had to do something to make a living, and the one thing he knew how to do was butcher a cow. So the day he left school, literally, he went and bought a cow, butchered it, cut it up, put it on a horse-drawn wagon, took it into town and sold it. Next morning, got up, did the same thing. Next morning, same thing. After a while, it was 2 cows a day, then 3 cows a day. By the time I came along and knew anything, my dad and my granddad were killing 5,000 to 7,000 head a week, putting them in semis and sending the stuff everywhere. McDonald's, we made 3 million to 4 million patties a day for them. And my granddad didn't have a lot of education, but he knew how to give 1,000 men a full-time job. He had an amazing attitude towards the Bible. He said, it's real simple. If God says it, you do it. That was it. He said, if it's in the Bible, you do it. One day he called me in and he said, Davy, I got a job for you. I said, sure, Grandpa, what? He said, we bought this farmer's cattle too cheap. Now, we raised a lot of cattle, but we bought a lot of cattle. And I looked at the stuff. I said, no, we didn't do anything wrong. I said, Grandpa, we just got a sweet deal. We were top bid at the auction, man. It was just a sweetheart. He said, that's not how a Christian does it, son. He said, you see, I'm commanded by God to watch out for them over me. And I'm supposed to do for them what I'd want them to do to me. He said, you want somebody, David, to buy your cattle too cheap? I said, no. He said, then don't you ever do it to anybody else. Now, he said, I've put this money in this envelope, and I want you to drive to this farm. That farm was 300 miles away. It's winter. There's snowstorms. He said, you drive to that farm, and you tell that farmer, I'm sorry. You tell him Earl Gibbs is a Christian, and we don't do this. And you give him this to make it right. Would you do that? Not me, man. If I can get the better end of a deal, I'm going to ring it blue because I'm out for. Is that right? You see, God says, I command you to be out for others. Took me a long time to get to that farm. Bad roads when I got there, man. About 9 at night, went up on the porch, knocked. And the farmer's wife came and she pulled the curtain back and looked out a little window, and she opened up, and I said, my name's Dave Gibbs, and my granddad Earl Gibbs sent me to tell you we're sorry. We bought your cattle too cheap. And we're Christians and we don't do that. And he wants to make it right here. By now her husband had come up. And she opened that and saw the money. She started to cry so hard she got a nosebleed. And her husband's hugging her. I'll never forget what she said. She said, what kind of man does this? You know what her husband said? A Christian. A real one. Is that you? Is that me? I made that trip a fair number of times. So did others. He watched the price of every cow. Because he said we're not going to be doing what God says shouldn't be happening. When my granddad passed away, they had a funeral viewing from noon until like 8 o'clock, and then the funeral was the next morning. They had to postpone the funeral for 2 days. Thousands of farmers showed up. We're in Ohio. They came from Montana and Illinois and Texas. A ton came from Virginia. And for 3 days, it was people walking by saying, let me tell you about your granddad. And what he did that nobody knows about. At the end of the trail for you, what are they going to say? No, not what will they say to be polite. What will they travel thousands of miles to come and say? The lady that I first handed that first money to, she and her husband are there. And she came out, and it's hard now looking at me that they all called me Little Gibbs back then. That's hard to think of. But she came up and hugged my neck. And she said, Little Gibbs, be like your granddad. He was real. You be real. At the end of the trail, they're going to say something. What would they say right now? You can change it. But you'll not change it by accident. It'll change when you say, by God's grace, I'm going to prefer others over myself.